Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Welcome to this Bright Blue event, which we're doing in partnership with NESTA and the Food Foundation. Embarrassingly, I haven't got a particularly healthy plate here. It's a sort of mixture of pineapple and pizza. It's not even a Hawaiian pizza. It's just sort of slabs of pineapple and pizza, so I apologise for that. And like I say, we're doing this in partnership, this event, with NESTA and the Food Foundation. And we did the same event at Labour Party conference, which was very interesting. So those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Our mission is to defend and improve liberal society. We do that across 4 main areas. That's employment policy, education policy, environment policy, and social policy. If you're tweeting, please do use the hashtags #BrightBlue and #CPC22. And if you say nice things, you can perhaps mention us in those tweets. And our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue. And you can also tweet the partners, which is @Nesta_UK, if you can remember that, and @Food_Foundation. So today's debate is looking at the issue of the whole plate, affordable, healthy and sustainable food. So we're looking really at the life cycle of food from production to consumption. And the questions we want to ask are, what's the strengths and weaknesses of the government's latest food strategy? Why does government keep watering down obesity policies? Why do they keep rolling back on them? And why did the government not adopt all of the recommendations from the independent National Food Strategy, which was led by Henry on my near right? And then where does the responsibility for eating more healthily lie? With manufacturers, government, farmers, individuals ourselves? What's the right balance and mix of responsibility? And then also thinking about the affordability side of stuff, particularly at a time now where inflation is becoming crippling. How do we ensure that everyone has access to affordable, nutritious food? Why is food poverty rising, and how do we mitigate it? So lots of questions to answer. No doubt there's lots of expertise in the room. There's also expertise somewhere out there watching on our live stream. So hello from wherever you might be, a beach or wherever. You can also interact with this session by asking questions. You could do so through Slido, and there's a link underneath the YouTube video. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and then I will ask those questions via my phone. So, an expert panel we have. So, to my near left, we have Joe Gideon, MP, who's the chair of the APPG on National Food Strategy and the Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. To my near right is Henry Dimbleby, who's the lead non-exec director at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as the lead on the government's National Food Strategy and co-founder of Leon Restaurants. Anna Taylor, on my far left, is the executive director of the Food Foundation. Next to Henry is Chris Smyth, who's the Whitehall editor at the Times. And then right at the far right of the panel is Ravi Gurumurthy, who's the chief executive of NESTA. And again, thank you to NESTA and the Food Foundation for partnering with us. So 5 minutes each, then we go to questions and contributions from the floor. And if we have more people, please do feel free, if you dare, to come down and stand at the side here, because I can see a lot of people waiting outside. Please, honestly, feel free to come in. Great. So we'll start with Joe. Over to you.
Thank you. So I feel as though I've got a little bit of imposter syndrome here, given that I'm not an expert on this subject. However, I'm passionate about how important it is. I first got involved in the APPG, I think within about a month of becoming a parliamentarian for a red wall seat in one of the most deprived areas of the country. And I didn't really know how food fitted into levelling up, for instance. It is fundamental and crucial and possibly more important than anything else that we are doing. And because of that, I delved more deeply into some of the challenges that are faced in constituencies like Stoke-on-Trent and how it aligns to lack of productivity, lack of educational attainment, massive health issues, people who are on long-term sick, and the linkage is clear, and the linkage is food. When I moved to Stoke-on-Trent, I didn't anticipate having a different diet, eating things differently, having different choices. I can tell you that, and I know colleagues from Stoke-on-Trent are here, maybe they'll correct me, but I can't find a single fast food takeaway that's healthy, that is specifically targeted on healthy choices. But in areas of deprivation, you have twice as many fast food outlets as other areas, and a lot of convenience food, a lot of junk food, and I think the debate is about not individual blame, not saying people just pick the wrong things. It's if you haven't got the choice. Now, having not got the choice is not just about finance. It's actually about retailers actually offering different choices in places like Stoke-on-Trent. But it's also about finances. And if you're on a tight budget, it's a lot easier to fill the stomachs of your children with foods that will satisfy them and fill them up with calories, but aren't necessarily going to be healthy. And we mustn't demonise individuals. We mustn't demonise parts of the country. We just must make it easier to be able to make the right choices. And for me, that's easier to make the right choices is very much around a level of government intervention where it's helpful. And I think that the obesity strategy and the measures put forward were helpful. So I've been very vocal in saying that I really don't want to see us roll back on that. To give people better choices means that the good choice is both affordable and the bad choice is unaffordable or less affordable, but also is flagged up as a bad choice. I had an experience a couple of days ago which quite shocked me. In our local hospital, I saw the Keep Stoke Smiling campaign, which is about looking at dental health, and we've got a terrible, in terms of league tables, we're really at the bottom for tooth decay in children. And, things like having Coca-Cola dispensers in schools and sugary snacks, promoted by certain people, that just is fundamentally wrong. So my interest in affordable, healthy, sustainable food comes out of a love of my constituency, of a recognition that people individually can't make those changes unless we make the kind of ecosystem of food much simpler for them. And I'm going to do a plug again because I do it at everyone. We're having a Stoke-on-Trent Food Summit in November to look at the entire food system and to challenge the idea that places like Stoke-on-Trent don't care about, people have said to me, oh, it's nanny statism, you should let people eat what they want, if they want to eat burgers every day, that's fine, and why should we care? Well, you're going to hear from the expert panel exactly why we should care, apart from the cost to the NHS, the cost to the economy, the cost to people's lives. Because, if you can't live a fulfilled life because you have diabetes from an early age, because you've had a diet that you didn't realise was doing you harm, or you couldn't afford an alternative, then that's got to be wrong, hasn't it? So that's my starter for 10. And,
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jo. Round of applause. Thank you. We had an event yesterday, and I asked Maggie Throop, who is former Public Health Minister. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this, but there are some of your colleagues in the Conservative Party and in the sort of wider centre-right family who say, there is a role for individual responsibility here. Not everybody in deprived circumstances eats unhealthily. Not everybody is obese. So this is surely indicative of the fact that some agency matters. And in fact, wouldn't it be very pessimistic, quite fatalistic, if we say, what you do as an individual, the choices and decisions you make, has no impact? That's quite a sort of pessimistic outlook, is it not?
Well, I'd throw something back at you, which is 76% of adults in Stoke-on-Trent are either obese or overweight, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily a choice. If you look at the statistics for other parts of the country, they're much lower. And therefore there's something bigger going on than the people who happen to live in Stoke-on-Trent happen to choose to eat unhealthily.
Okay, thank you, Jo. Henry, over to you.
So I thought it'd be worth just setting out what we recommended in the food strategy and where we are in terms of how much is getting done and how much isn't. It's worth defining kind of why the patient is sick before we prescribe treatment. And you have to recognise that there is a lot in the food system that is working extraordinarily well. We feed 7.8 billion people off a slightly lower amount of land that fed 2.5 billion people in 1945. We produce 1.7 times the number of calories per person on the planet from that amount of land. We have an unprecedented array of food in our supermarkets, and it's unprecedentedly cheap. But creating that system, largely through the Green Revolution and then advances in packaging, marketing, and transporting food, has created two other huge problems. The first is the problem to our health, and it is really very difficult to overstate how bad that is. The fact that Chris Whitty, one of the busiest men in the country during the pandemic, was giving a series of online lectures in his spare time about the harm that diet was doing to the health system. It's estimated now that the NHS will be spending more treating type 2 diabetes alone in 2035 than it does today on all cancers. If we don't solve this problem, the health service is just going to suck in the money from every other part of the state. It's completely, literally unsustainable. And then the second part is the environmental side. So the food system is by far the biggest cause of the collapse of biodiversity, of deforestation, of pollution of fresh water, of shortage of fresh water, and along with energy, it's one of the two big causes of climate change. And we identified two feedback loops that are going wrong that are creating those problems. The first we call the junk food cycle. This is simply the recognition that genetically, and this comes to your question about individuality, people have different evolved appetites. As a population, our appetite evolved at a time when it was important to spend a lot of effort seeking out highly calorie-dense food, high in sugar and sugar and fat, and actually when it's low in fibre, you eat more of it, doesn't make you full. And so we are programmed to seek out this food that, whereas it used to be quite hard to find honey, it's now there in front of you in the supermarket. And some people's genes are skewed more towards that. Some people have to fight harder against the tide of their appetite than others do. And food companies, not because they're evil, not because they wake up every morning thinking, how do we kind of kill our children, but simply because it is easier to market that stuff, spend a disproportionate amount of their money marketing that stuff. 85% of the products produced by the three major fast-moving consumer goods companies are too unhealthy to be marketed to children. So you have this vicious cycle, which is we love the stuff, they spend more money marketing it, we eat more, they spend more, we eat more, they spend more, and we get sick. And that is not something that they can get them. They are as stuck in that cycle as we are. So I went to the board away day of one of the big cereals companies who actually make quite good cereals relatively, and their whole product development line was their cereals with chocolate on them, their cereals with sugar on them, and they were saying, this isn't what we want to be doing, but we're stuck in that, and you need regulation to solve that. The other part is what Partha Dasgupta, the economist, called the invisibility of nature, which is on the environmental side. We don't build the cost of nature into any of the ways in which we measure human success. It's not in our wallets, it's not in the balance sheets of companies, we don't put it in GDP, and in fact governments worldwide, we don't only not give nature a cost, we spend $500 billion a year subsidising activities that destroy nature. We pay people to destroy nature. And so my recommendations were built around trying to reverse those two feedback loops. So we first of all had a set of recommendations around breaking the junk food cycle. The centre part of that was a sugar and salt tax to drive reformulation. Regulation in this area is very difficult. There are all sorts of ways in which companies will work their way around it, and so I actually favour the higher up you can get the intervention, the better. We then had recommendations around trying to reduce the inequality. A lot of these things have visited much more violently on people who are less rich, and actually we argued that interventions such as Healthy Start, where you give people money to buy fruit and veg and milk, even though some people kind of don't like the idea from ideological points of view, because it's not giving freedom to people. Actually, they work. Free school meals work. Healthy Start works. Holiday activity and food programs, giving poorer children food and activity through the holidays work. And so we argued that go with what works, not with an ideology. And then the third set of recommendations was how we make better use of our land. How do we build the incentives around the environmental land management scheme, around planning, to ensure that actually, when we look at our farming system, we're not just trying to maximise yield, we're trying to produce good food while restoring nature and sequestering carbon. And then finally, at the moment, 50% of the food we eat is processed. We need to change that. Fundamentally, that is problematic, but we're not going to change that overnight. So we described two shifts. One is getting the system we have today, getting that processed stuff a bit better, and the other is over time changing our food culture. People say, "Oh, you can't change your food culture; it's impossible." You know, but there's a meme that's going around the internet which shows what the Japanese think of different people in Europe, and like in France, it's no fat people, and England, UK, it's just bad food. And that is not the case anymore. We've already begun at the high end, at the restaurant end, to change our food culture. We can change cultures. Cultures do and can change. So where then finally are the government with these things? The junk food cycle, in the food strategy that the government published, said they were going to leave the junk food cycle to the Health Disparities White Paper that SAJ was meant to be putting into place. And then obviously Boris resigned. That has been kicked down the track. The rumour is that Therese Coffey doesn't want to publish it. However, I would make the observation that you cannot find, I've certainly not been able to find, anyone who has worked as a minister or Secretary of State in the Department for Health and Social Care, or Department for Health as it was, who talks about the nanny state, not mentioning intervention. Everyone goes into that department thinking ideologically, you know, we don't want the nanny state. They look at the numbers, they go, fucking hell, this is a nightmare. And they could very quickly, they change their ideology. And Therese is a very data-focused person, so I'm very interested to see what she's going to come out with. On inequality, actually, the government has done a fantastic amount. So they did holiday activity and food. They boosted Healthy Start. I think there's more that they can do now on free school meals. The benefit of free school meals is being inflated away, and we have a very good event tomorrow with Michael Gove talking about how we need to transform what we do on free school meals. On the environment, where I am the lead non-executive director at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, again, all of the kind of rumours have been that everything's being put on hold. I actually am quite optimistic. I think that consecutive Secretary of State in DEFRA have put in place the most ambitious and carefully thought through programme for transforming a food system anywhere in the Western world. And I can't imagine that, A, they would be able to rip it up because all of the stakeholders on both sides want it to happen, and B, that they'd want to. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but we'll wait and see. And then on the kind of long-term changing of food culture, I think it would be fair to say that over the last 3 years, government hasn't had that much time to think about the long term. They've largely been dealing with more short-term issues, so not much is happening there.
Great. Thank you, Henry. So a question I had was, I mean, you talked towards the end saying the plans that you drew up, that would be the sort of most ambitious of any Western country. Are there countries or cities that do this very well in terms of the kind of policy and regulatory landscape that they have around production and consumption of food? Are there sort of case studies we should be looking at?
There's no one who is doing the whole package. I would argue that on the... people say, you know, the two things are very connected. Actually, the solutions... There are some areas where the solutions are connected, but you can imagine creating a food system which was environmentally friendly but still killed us. And you can imagine it'd be possible to create a food system that was good for our bodies but still destroyed the environment. On the environmental side, without doubt, because we'd left the EU and had the opportunity to do it, our environmental package on farming is without doubt ahead of anything else in the Western world. It's really an extraordinary piece of policy, and it would be a an absolute disaster if the Tory party were to go back on that, because that is really an absolute, something that you should be shouting around the world, people to look at in terms of progressive policy. It's fantastic. On the health side, people are doing, no one's cracked it. No one has yet reversed obesity. You go, for example, Amsterdam is often talked about as a kind of role model, and you go and see the people in Amsterdam, and they're like, we still haven't done it. They're trying to do a lot. The Guardian wrote a piece about how it was great, and now everyone comes to see us as if we've got all the answers, and we don't. So I think it would be fair to say that on health, we're all still fumbling around. And one of the reasons we're fumbling around, and maybe Chris will talk to this in his piece, is because it is unbelievably difficult to get legislation, sufficient legislation on health through. You know, if you look at what Camilla Cavendish and George Osborne did with the sugary drinks industry levy, they had to put it in the finance bill so it didn't go for right around, because they knew that if it had gone for right around, it would have been killed. So it's an incredibly difficult area to get policy in place.
Great. Thank you for giving us a little bit of policy tourism there and a chance to promote Bright Blue. You've promoted Stoke. I'm going to promote Bright Blue. We did a report about 5 years ago called A Greener, More Pleasant Land, where we talked about the new way to fund farmers post-Brexit coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy, and the concept of public money for public benefit and paying farmers to do ecosystem services was fleshed out in that report. So please do check that out. And you know, we're obviously very keen for the government to maintain that commitment to the new environmental land management scheme. There have been promises from DEFRA, but Chris may point to this. There's obviously a lot of tension politically on how best to go in terms of supporting farmers. Right, Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Ryan, for hosting us today. I arrived yesterday afternoon at here at the ICC, and I went straight to Starbucks for a cup of tea, and I ended up talking to a counsellor I'd never met before, and he was saying, why are you here, what do you do, etc. And I was telling him, and I ended up saying I was really worried about the impact of the cost of living crisis on what people were going to be eating. And he made a comment which I think, I'm telling you because I think very many people hold this view across the political spectrum, and it's a very normal view to hold, and that's that he said, well, I cook from scratch, and I think I do it pretty cheaply. So kind of what's the problem? So, and I'm not in any way blaming him for his views. As I say, it's very, very widely held, but I thought it would be useful just to step back and say, right, well, so what do the numbers tell us about that issue, so that we can contextualise our own personal experience in perhaps a wider set of experiences of different people across the country. So start first of all with the question of cost and price. So if you look at the government data, if you're in the poorest decile of the population, this is a couple of years ago data, it's the most up-to-date we have, you're spending about £4.30 a day on food per person, and if you're in the wealthiest, you're spending about double that. So that's your, if you imagine that's your sort of working budget, £4.30. You might live in a place, as Joe talked about, where you've got to travel to get to somewhere that might sell, you know, an Aldi or a Lidl that might sell really cheap fruit and veg. That might be a bus journey. Might not even be a bus journey, you might even have to get a taxi, and there's a question of carrying all your stuff. You've got to kind of factor that in if you've not got a car. A co-op, yes. So there's the question of the environment that's around you. Then there's the question of cooking, and I think there's a sort of an automatic assumption that people on a low income cook less than people on a high income, and in fact the evidence from the Food Standards Agency shows the opposite. In fact, the poorest people tend to, almost all of them, I think it's 78% of people on an income less than £10,000 a year cook at least once a day, whereas it's only 55% of those people on incomes above £50,000. So actually some of our perceptions around cooking don't seem to stand up. And then I think you've got to now factor in a few other challenges for low-income families. Poor facilities at home. So some families are cooking only with a microwave or some only with a kettle, particularly if they're in temporary accommodation. And then on top of that, you've now got the energy prices, which we've just surveyed, done a big YouGov survey, and 1 in 10 parents are saying that they're now shifting to cold food rather than heating up food because they're worried about the energy costs. In fact, we interviewed, one of my team interviewed somebody in this circumstance this week, and she was explaining that she's juggling putting on the broadband versus cooking the meal. She said, well, I want the kids to be able to do their homework with broadband, so I'm actually cooking them cold food, and I'm working out when to turn what to turn on in order to allow that to happen. Sorry? Yeah, there they are, absolutely. But unfortunately, the gap still is quite significant for the lowest income families. And then there's a few other challenges. Waste is another challenge, which low-income families repeatedly say we're really worried about trying something new with our kids because we're worried it's going to go in the bin if they don't like it, and there's nothing else to kind of give people. So real conservativeness around trying new things. And then a last factor, which I thought was kind of very interesting from a research that Centre for Food Policy have recently done, talking about how, obviously, for everybody, what we eat is a really vital part of how we interact with one another, how we show one another love is by serving each other nice food. And for families, what their research found is that for families that are cutting back on things like holiday clubs or after-school activities or things at the weekend, buying a takeaway is sometimes the kind of cheap way to actually have a bit of a treat and an opportunity to have a social interaction, that, you know, a nice evening with your kids. And I think food can often, or if, you know, your kid's asking for trainers and you can't afford trainers, well, we'll get some sweets instead. It's a kind of a cheap way of being able to create a bit of social connection and love. So I think going back to the sort of thoughts about when I met the councillor yesterday, I think what I think is true is that it's not impossible to eat well on a very low income. And indeed, if any of you have looked at Jack Monroe's documentation of the incredible meticulous nature of counting pennies and getting to the point where she spent very, very little on a good meal, it's not impossible. But I think the point is that for very many families, it's overwhelmingly hard to do that. And what we're really interested in is how can we shift the system so it's a bit less hard for those families? How can we make sure that promotions are on the good stuff, that the good stuff's positioned in the right place in supermarkets, that planning policy allows good food places to be in the poorest neighbourhoods? How can we make sure that advertising is for the best things? We've set up an initiative called Veg Power, which is all about advertising veg to kids. It's a small example of the way in which you can use the power of advertising for the good stuff. And how do we rebalance prices so that the most affordable diets are also the ones which do us good?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. So one thing I was thinking about was, you know, parents often, you know, sweets are often a reward for children if they've done well. And then obviously as we get older, we think, gosh, you know, I'll treat myself to a takeaway or whatever, or some very nice food. Is that a problem, do you think, that sort of connection between food, which is very high in fat, sugar and salt, and that sort of reward thing? Is that a problem that you would want to sort of kind of deconstruct, or actually we should be saying that's still a treat, but making sure it's only in very kind of rare situations?
Yeah, I think that's the point. Of course, we all enjoy these foods and we want to be able to eat them. And this is not about banning all nice, delicious things that we might treat our kids with. I think what's happened, though, and what we described actually in the National Food Strategy report, was how foods which are, you know, whether you want to call them junk foods, ultra-processed foods, foods which have been manipulated to really be energy dense and pack that punch. They've taken over so many food categories now that we're eating half of our calories come from these foods. And I think the fact is that they've become so abundant in our culture, in the way that we treat our kids, in all forms of life. They're part of our food memories, and we've got quite a lot of, I mean, even if we want to get that down to 30%, it's a really big journey to go on to get us to the point where we're a bit less dependent on these foods. So I don't think in and of itself treating your kids with something nice to eat is a problem at all. But I think the problem is that those foods are now everywhere. They're not just for treats.
Okay, thank you. I fear this plate is almost becoming an emblem of this whole topic.
Looks like a school meal.
Yeah, and I'm not going to. I'm not going to eat it in front of everybody. So, Max, do you mind just taking? It's just so. Yeah, it's just not a good thing to have. So, thank you. Great. Okay, let's move to Chris. So, I mean, Henry raised this point, which is, people go in to the Department for Health and then are converted and think, God, we really need to do something about it. During the pandemic, of course, the very unfortunate circumstance happened with Boris. And then there seemed to be a huge enthusiasm about doing something around obesity, considering the linkage between COVID and obesity. But then it never, the momentum doesn't continue. So what's the political blockages here?
Yeah, I think like many things during the pandemic, it's one of the many things that people just want to forget and pretend never happened and put it behind them. And in terms of how the politics interact with the policy here, I think given where we are now with this government and this Prime Minister, I can't think of a time when I've been covering this when food, health and sustainability is lower down the political agenda, frankly. Specifically, this combination of this Prime Minister with the economic circumstances that we're in makes it very hard for progress to be made. That's where we are bluntly. I mean, if we work out how we got to this point, you talked about the food strategy, both Henry's one and the government's one in the summer. We already sort of moved on to a different world from then. And if you go back to when Michael Gove was Environment Secretary and commissioned Henry to do his review, that what in retrospect now seems to be in the last gasp sort of Cameroon modernisation of the Tory party and saying, look, we can't just be about free markets and government getting out of the way. It's got to be about taking the whole of society with us and bringing and using regulation in a sort of judicious way. That obviously led to Henry's report, very thorough and comprehensive piece of work, lots of interesting recommendations in there. By the time that final section of that came out, obviously we had the Johnson government who very quickly dismissed elements of it, notably the tax one, said we didn't want to be lecturing people and was sort of very focused by that point on domestic food security given the war in Ukraine, and its sort of political focus had shifted there. But nonetheless, sort of under the bonnet of that, there was still consideration being given to some of the other sort of less high-profile measures in there, whether it's sort of mandatory calorie reporting, inspections of school meals, all that kind of thing was still on the table, I think, under Boris Johnson. And then obviously you've got Liz Truss coming in. The plan for growth last week was absolutely explicit. They will judge every policy on whether it delivers growth. That's it. That's the only metric that they have. When it comes to food, their main thing is about agricultural productivity, how you get that up. They've obviously ditched elements of the obesity strategy, thinking about getting rid of the sugar tax. The disparities white paper, is under review. They formally haven't ditched it yet, but I can't see them going ahead with any of the more harder edge things that are in there, and certainly none of the recommendations in Henry report seem particularly likely to feature there. But then obviously you have the events of this morning where the government U-turned on one of its key measures of its economic plan. And I think what that shows us is the government does not have a majority in its own party for stuff that is unpopular amongst Conservatives. So obviously that particular measure was the main one. At the moment, I don't see any sign that any of these food or health measures are attracting the same level of discontent amongst Conservative MPs. But it is now easier to see a path where you build a coalition of 30 or 40 MPs, and then you can actually say this isn't going to get through. So that turn is possible. I mean, I haven't seen any sign of obesity. I mean, even on some of the agricultural stuff last week, someone in number 10 yesterday was saying to me from the much more gung-ho deregulation side of things in a rather disappointed tone, I don't think we are going to be ditching any, all of these agricultural and environmental protections. I think even we're still going to have to do even the mad Zach Goldsmith stuff. So the sort of Liz Truss ideologues are slightly in retreat, even after a week. But how that will play out, I think, it interacts with her political strength elsewhere is still very uncertain. So in terms of where that leads us to the next election, I think we've got to be realistic that anything fiscal is probably off the table. The Labour Party conference last week was very striking to see Labour saying, no, we're not going to ban buy one get one free deals in the middle of a cost of living crisis either. That kind of thing, extension of taxes. I think those are in the deep freeze for now. But in the longer term, I think this is something that is not going to be driven top down, because that is what invites the nanny state measures. It is something that is going to come bottom up. You can already see the food industry adjusting to consumer demand on that kind of thing. The range of meatless and plant-based products is far bigger than it was because there's consumer demand for that. I mean, Henry's interesting stuff about alternative protein is starting to happen. You can see that going further. Yes, obviously that starts amongst the sort of health-conscious middle classes who perhaps need it less, but that will, like many food fascists, ultimately, in the phrase of the moment, trickle down. And the polling on this is quite interesting. We did some of it last week. In terms of the sugar tax, 64% of people want to keep it, including 59% of Tory voters. Even the bog-off ban, 57% say it should go ahead now, including 49% of Tory voters. So this nanny state stuff is actually quite popular because people see their children getting unhealthy and fat, and they don't like it. Where we started from, I've been covering this area for more than a decade now. It started with David Cameron coming in saying all that new Labour nanny state nonsense, we're going to ditch it. U-turned, introduced the sugar tax. Theresa May comes in saying all that Cameroon nonsense, ditch it, we're going to save Tony the Tiger. U-turned, introduced a set of restrictions on promotions and marketing. Boris Johnson came in saying, we're going to ditch all of that nanny state nonsense. U-turn, introduced the same promotions again. So Liz Truss comes in and says, we're going to get rid of all that nanny state stuff. Does seem to be part of a pattern, and ultimately, the same ending may ensue.
Will she get the time to do the U-turn? That's the question.
Well, there is that.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Maybe an optimistic reading there. You're right to sort of flag some scepticism within the Labour Party as well for some of these measures. Wes Streeting was quite vocal on this last week. I'm interested in the levy on sugary drinks and whether that can be extended. Richard Walker from Iceland, managing director of Iceland, was on a panel yesterday and thought actually, he was quite sceptical of a lot of the obesity policies at the moment. He thought that was the wrong priority. But he could see a case for extending the levy to more products rather than just sugary drinks. He thought that would make sense. But surely from a political angle, you could see direction on that because there's already a levy in place. It's obviously extended to a few more products. But can you see a political opportunity with that?
Not really right now, to be honest, both because, Liz Truss is ideologically, instinctively dislikes that and is obviously thinking about getting rid of what we have, and partly because, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, it is going to be politically difficult. People who oppose it will immediately saying you're making our shopping bills more expensive when people are struggling to get by, and that's why obviously Labour said we're not going to do it because they don't want to be open to that attack either. I think after the next election the context may change. We certainly hope the economy has improved, but even then, after an election, whoever wins, obviously looking more likely to be Labour, and they can come in and say, well, actually we are going to do this stuff, and there would obviously be more scope for Conservative government if they do turn things around by then to come in and say, actually we've looked at it again and now's the moment to do it. But coming up to an election in a cost of living crisis, I don't think is the time that you're going to see more fiscal measures.
Great, thank you, Chris. Right, so finally we'll move to Ravi. Tell us some clever policies which might help, where we don't necessarily have to tax and spend, perhaps.
That's going to be a short talk. I'm Ravi. I lead NESTA. For those of you who don't know us, we design and test solutions to big societal challenges. We try and run experiments on the ground. We try and build ventures, and we also try and shape policy. And we decided to make obesity one of our 3 big missions for the next 10 years because I think the scale of the challenge is massive. I think it's come through a bit in this talk, but it's worth just reiterating how big it is. So 28% of the country is obese. 63% is overweight. I think the fact that it's a majoritarian issue, it's not a minority, means that the politics of this should be a little bit different. And also, if you are thinking about being a sort of small state conservative, as Henry talked about before, the burden on the NHS is massive. It's really, really significant and growing. So there is a case for sort of thinking about this in a more aggressive way. I think you asked sort of clever policies. I think one of the kind of challenges here is that we've got the wrong mental model for how to tackle obesity. Our mental model is that this is something that requires willpower, an individual initiative, and it usually requires a short, sharp shock, a big diet, and maybe a bit of exercise, going for a run. And I think all of those heuristics are wrong, and they've been tried and failed over the last 20 years, and they just don't work. And the way to think about this is that we are eating too much, but not by a huge amount. So if everyone cut out the equivalent of a Walker's packet of crisps, and they did it for a long period of time, for 2-3 years, that would be a dramatic reduction in obesity levels in this country. So if we want to get back to 1990 levels of obesity, then we need about a 10% to 15% reduction in calorie intake, but it needs to be sustained. And the way we do that is, as Henry's report brilliantly sets out, you've got to tackle the food environment. We've got to it's got to be easy for children and adults to walk down a street, go to a restaurant, and it to be easy to eat the healthy thing. At the moment, we're all probably trying our best, but we're bombarded with unhealthy things at every single opportunity. And it's incredibly hard, given the reasons actually Henry set out before, to fly into that gale force wind, which is what we're doing at the moment. So I think there are ways of tackling this. And the sugary drinks levy, I think, is a brilliant, the soft drinks industry levy is a brilliant example of it. And I think it's often misunderstood the mechanism through which that works. So that worked because it was carefully calibrated, the threshold at which companies would pay tax. And it was set well ahead of time. And what happened was all those companies basically reformulated their drinks to duck under the levy. It was a brilliant way of encouraging tax evasion. And that sort of process could be done across a whole set of other products. And what's brilliant about it is that we don't realise that we're taking in fewer calories. We're surprisingly unsensitive to marginal changes in portion size or even in levels of sugar. And that's why I think something like a sugar tax, either case by case on particular foods or across the board, is a really good way of stealthily taking out sugar from our diets. I think the final thing I would just say about this is that on the politics, there's a lot of criticism about this being nanny state. It's interesting how the word nanny state has shifted in meaning over the years. I mean, I think nanny state before used to be about regulation that's genuinely reduced my freedom to do things. Now we talk about nanny state being lecturing, which could mean just informing people about whether they're eating bad food. So nanny state itself has become a sort of catch-all, loosely used term to describe things we just don't like. I think there are very, very good reasons why we should actually take a different approach to this. One, the kind of things we're talking about, like sugar taxes, are less interventionist than many of the things we take for granted right now that we accept, whether it's seatbelt use or taxing tobacco or speed limits or taxes on alcohol. All those things are accepted, yet why not this? Secondly, it's actually with the grain of what we want as a society. Nobody wants to see their 11-year-old become obese, yet 1 in 4 11-year-olds are obese, more than 1 in 4. And so I think most people, as I think Chris mentioned, want to tackle obesity. So regulating with the grain, helping people to help themselves, I think is a very different type of intervention than trying to persuade people to do something that they don't actually want to do themselves. I think the third thing here is that this is just not just a cost to individuals, it is a cost to society, and that does give a rationale for intervention. And finally, if you are interested in trying to shift the tax burden away from things like work and income, then we have to actually get serious about taxing bads, taxing carbon, taxing sugar. So there are many reasons why I think we need to rethink this. I think the biggest one I want to come back to is this mental model of what you do to tackle obesity, because I think unless we shift that and work out that it's not about individual willpower, we won't get to the kind of policy changes that Henry's talked about in his report so well. Finally, I'll just say in terms of what we're doing, one of the things we're doing is actually trying to analyse what people eat. It's a surprisingly hard question to answer. So we've got all the data on what people are eating and trying to cluster them into different types of group to work out what are the foods we should be reformulating. Where should we be applying the next set of sugar taxes? And I think that's the analysis that will be coming out relatively shortly. So hopefully that'll be a good contribution.
Great, thank you, Ravi. So Ravi, it strikes me there's a sort of, at the moment, there are two key policies in this agenda which the government have implemented. The first is the sugary drinks levy. The second obviously came in earlier this year, which is the calorie counting on menus. Now, the evidence base around the levy seems particularly strong. What about calorie counting? Because I've heard mixed things about that, and there are some groups, particularly people representing people with eating disorders, who think actually it's quite harmful. So, interested in your take on the efficacy of that policy.
Yeah, good question. So I think the theory behind this is that obviously if a certain number, even a minority of people, take an action and decide to not take the sticky toffee pudding on the menu, then A, they will get healthier, but more importantly, it will force, those companies will start reformulating. They'll shift them, they'll change their recipes. Now that's the sort of, I think, theory behind this over time. I think the question that we have to answer empirically is that true? Are people changing their behaviour? Are menus getting healthier? And that's the thing I think we don't know the answer to yet. We're trying to do some work on it. We tested that in a sort of artificial environment in a simulation and got some positive results. But the proof is in the sticky toffee pudding. But but you're absolutely right about the harm here. There is also a potential harm if people with eating disorders potentially, this could be very, very, very difficult. So I think the question we've got to answer evidentially is to look at, is it actually causing harm? But also, is it actually producing the good? So I would, rather than make a knee-jerk response right now, I would really actively try and think about commissioning the right evidence to make sure we can make any decisions, if necessary, later down the line.
Tell you're not a politician. Right, okay, let's open it up to questions from the floor. So if you're on the live stream, just to remind you that you can ask questions through Slido, or you can ask questions through Twitter by using the hashtag #BrightBlue, and they will come to me on my phone and I will ask them. Let's take questions from the floor first. Please wait for the microphone because people on the live stream need to hear it. Say who you are and where you're from. So we'll start with this gentleman here. I'll take three.
Thank you very much. Simon Delat from West Suffolk Conservatives. Very quickly, I just want to say a couple of things. The sugar tax has actually brought about a switch to artificial, highly processed, zero-calorie sweeteners, not necessarily desirable. Question for all the panel is, I think we'd all agree that education is a very strong way out of poverty. Should we be educating children at school and teaching them how to cook? And if not, why not?
Okay, thank you, Simon. Let's go to Laura here.
Thanks very much, and very, very important points about actually the impact of this on our health system. And I don't know whether people know that over the last 5 years there's been a 25% increase in amputations due to type 2 diabetes. So this is, and that's a very stark representation of why we set up the Food Foundation, which was because we were seeing young children arriving at school both malnourished and obese at the same time. I wonder whether there's a framing of our discussions about food as well, which needs to really look at this long-term safety issue. And I wonder what, both sort of Henry, Chris and Ravi and Joe and Anna think around this issue about the Food Standards Agency. I used to be a deputy chair there and tried to encourage them to look not just at the immediate lack of safety of a product, but actually the long-term impacts of continual use of a product. And that actually then starts to deliver us a very different analysis of what food safety is if it's delivering the bad outcomes that we're seeing today.
Great, so the role of the FSA. And then this lady here just stood up. Yeah.
Thanks. Sophia and I work for the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. I guess one thing that isn't often talked about is the role of animal agriculture. from a sustainability perspective and a health perspective. I'd be interested to know what you think the role of sort of meat reduction is in this longer term plan. I guess question for Henry, and you sort of mentioned it briefly, Chris.
Great, thank you. So questions on teaching about cooking in the curriculum, the role of the FSA, and then thinking about meat, production of meat and farming and agriculture. So, Anna, perhaps the issue around the curriculum, you might want to talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, Henry's the pro on all this, but...
I wrote it.
Yeah, exactly. So absolutely, Simon, I mean, certainly in my view, we should be... At the moment, there are, we do have stuff in the curriculum around cooking skills, but for a number of reasons, many schools are not necessarily implementing those, applying those bits of the curriculum in the classroom, and there are various barriers to doing so, and some of which in the National Food Strategy there was a whole package that was recommended to try and get that off the ground. I think it's obviously a vital life skill, and too many people don't know how to cook, so I completely agree with you. Do you want to move on to the other one, FSA? Or?
Yeah, you can do if you want to. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point about the Food Standards Agency and this question of safety and how we define the scope and boundaries around the term safety, particularly now. I mean, I think there's also what we're seeing around the kind of whole ultra-processed food evidence is that there's sort of new kind of set of hypotheses which might suggest that foods which are highly processed carry health risks which are independent of the nutrients which are in them, but to do with the processing itself, the packaging, the additives. I think it's linked to do with inflammation and some of the hypotheses. It's still quite early science, but it's sort of pointing to a bigger safety agenda, I suppose, around food, which I hope the Food Standards Agency will start to get more involved in, for sure. Yeah.
Joe, any points you want to come back, particularly sort of reducing meat consumption?
Well, yes, and I mean, I wanted to come back on the education piece, because I think that there is a piece missing, which is a public health education to the nation rather than just within schools. Because yes, I agree, cooking skills for children, but this is also about families. There's an intergenerational challenge as well. And I mean, I don't know about you. I'm not a food expert, so. I struggle to know what's healthy when I go to a supermarket. There are traffic light systems, there's all sorts of labelling, it's terribly complex. The point that was made about sugar substitutes, and I assume that they're not healthy just because they replace sugar, they give you other problems. I mean, I genuinely think that it's a completely challenging landscape for anybody to make the right choices, even if they want to. And somehow, public health has a responsibility to make it simpler.
Great, thank you, Joe. Henry.
Just briefly on education. So I did a piece of work when Michael Gove was Education Secretary called the School Food Plan, and along with universal infant free school meals, which, by the way, I don't think the Tory party owns enough, because it's a fundamental change in the way that we treat children in schools. But one of those was to put cooking on the curriculum as compulsory, and the wording of it, we managed to get instill a love of cooking, the idea of cooking as a creative pursuit, savoury dishes, etc., etc. But it's a really great example of the limits of the state at making change happen. So passing a law may sometimes be necessary, but it is never sufficient. And I have a charity called Chefs in Schools that works with over 100 schools and growing, transforming the food that they cook and their education. And time after time, we go into schools and it's not happening. And I actually think there's a local ground-up spreading of knowledge and passion that needs to happen. Actually, that's one of the things we're trying to do, is massively accelerate what we're doing with Chefs in Schools. And I think you also have to separate the what from the how. I actually slightly disagree with Joe. I think people do know, on the whole, and surveys show what they should be eating, but there is a big gap in the cooking. On meat, absolutely we have to reduce the amount of meat. It's not about carbon, actually. It's about land. 85% of the land that we used to feed the UK, which is an area of land significantly larger than the UK, is used either to produce meat or grow food that's fed to meat. And you cannot solve the equation of producing enough food and restoring biodiversity and sequestering carbon unless you significantly reduce meat and take some of that land back out for something else, probably by about 30%. I don't actually think it's going to be necessary I'm quite optimistic that the government doesn't need to intervene, which thank God, because as Chris will tell you, where people are actually pretty positive about health intervention, I think it would be almost impossible for any government to intervene in a significant way to try and get people to reduce it.
Okay, interesting. So you don't think, I mean, you're right, it's about land, but it's also about reducing carbon emissions, and based in the CCC calculations around emissions reduction, meat consumption reduction is part of that.
Yeah.
Your feeling is that we won't need public policy to support that transition, it will just happen.
So I think two reasons for that. First of all, where reducing the amount of junk food will hurt the P&Ls of some food companies, they can do that meat transition without it. So, for example, if you speak to Deliveroo or Just Eat, all these companies, they're looking at the health problem. They can't do anything about it. There's literally nothing they can do, and they need government intervention. So they're all doubling down on meat because they know that they can switch their customers and actually make their customers very happy and feel better about themselves and save the planet. So there's no profit issue. The other thing that's going to happen is at the bottom end, meat alternatives. So, for example, 60% of the milk that New Zealand sends to China is in the form of milk powder. We're very close to the stage where you're going to be able to ferment milk powder at a cost significantly below the cost you can do it by putting it through a cow. Why on earth would you have a hugely massive ruminant wondering about turning grass into milk, emitting carbon, taking up space, when you can get something for half the price that doesn't do that? So I think you'll see at the bottom end, you'll see a lot of mince, powdered milk. Actually, the processed food that is causing us harm will actually be the saviour in some degree in the environmental space.
Very interesting. Chris, any thoughts, particularly on the meat consumption thing, in terms of, you know, if there isn't a sort of real pressure around that, how you think the wider public will react?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the areas where I have some sympathy with being a politician, and I think one of the interesting things that Henry said in his report of all the public opinion research he did, the one thing he found was totally politically toxic was some kind of meat tax, and that's the one thing that people would just absolutely would not tolerate. And you know, people do not like politicians lecturing them. They really viscerally dislike it, and politicians are very nervous of doing anything that is seen as finger wagging in that way. So I just don't think it can be led by politicians. It's got to be, you know, led bottom up, or by people who are frankly more popular and more respected than politicians, whether that's, you know, your Marcus Rashfords or other people. And you know, it is happening already from consumer driven and indeed a finance driven point of view. So that is not something that I think is going to be politically led, and it doesn't really need to be.
Yeah. Ravi, any thoughts?
Just want to come back to this Food Standards Agency point. I think it's always an interesting question in any public policy issue to ask who is in charge. And do they actually have the power to actually do what they need to do? And I think there is an institutional gap in this area. I liken it to climate change before the Climate Change Committee. And before that, we didn't have anybody who said, look, what's the target? Who's got to do what to get to it? And actually had the authority to make credible recommendations. I think that's a gap in the system right now. I don't know whether it's the right idea to add it to the Food Standards Agency or create a separate body, but I think it's a really, really good question. And the second thing is just on education. I think it's a really good suggestion, and I think there's loads of fantastic work and we should do more of it. The only word of caution I would make is there's a slight risk that you then think we can just rely on those individuals who now know more to cook better within the kind of bad food environment that we live in. And it's both and, I think. And I just want to sort of pick up on this sort of top-down, bottom-up point. I think you're right to say there is momentum from all parts of society, from industry, from consumer groups, and there is progress. But without some degree of government initiative, the pace and scale will not be enough. And I think, again, if you compare this to climate change only got gripped with a cross-party consensus and aggressive action because of leadership from industry, from consumers, from celebrities, but also from certain political entrepreneurs who decide to push their own parties. And I think we need the same change over the next 10 years. I'm, like other people on this panel, are actually quite optimistic that that could happen for all the reasons we've discussed.
Great. More questions and contributions. So we'll start with this gentleman here. Just if you could wait for the microphone, that would be great.
Okay. David Bertram from EUK Consulting. This is a question picking up on, I think, a couple of things Joe said. And it is acknowledged that there are healthy food deserts. Question: how can one compel or inspire small retailers to open shops where there are not currently shops, which will offer fresh vegetables at an attractive price? It's a difficult circle to square. And on the converse of that, there are places where whole parades are full of hot food takeaways. It is possible, though controversial, not to award new licenses or use classes for hot food takeaways. It is almost impossible to declassify a premise for any use class, including hot food takeaways. There is no appetite, is there, for a change to the planning system or anything else that will reduce the number of hot food takeaways? So 2 problems, how can they be addressed?
Okay, very interesting. And then I think, yes, this gentleman right here.
Yeah, so my name's Karen Basra. I'm from the Better Business Act team. So, I mean, just following up on something Henry said about the junk food cycle, and sort of talking about the big FMCG brands and the fact that they kind of know that this is a proven model that they can sort of reinvest in over time. And it sort of sounds as though there's shareholder pressure to maintain that model. And I just wondered whether directors' duties might need to be looked at again to allow directors the space to kind of think about these issues more holistically and sort of more broadly.
Okay. Some more questions. This lady here.
Hello, I'm Harriet English from a charity called Plunkett Foundation, and we support community groups to set up and run community businesses. We're seeing a growing movement of communities getting very interested in every stage of the food industry, so from rural retailing, for example, community abattoirs, and food and farming and growing. And I was interested to ask the panel, and we've mentioned kind of individuals, we've mentioned industry, but just to hear your thoughts on the role that communities can play in creating greater access to food for everybody.
Great, thank you. And then there's a lady right at the back in the doorway.
Hi. Following on from the Aldi and Lidl theme that we touched on earlier, both Sainsbury's and the Co-op are maintaining uneconomic fruit and vegetable departments, but they're trying to move them to the front to get people to be attracted to them first rather than the lunch deals. Those are being moved out of sight into the middle. I think we need to support these a lot more and stop going to Aldi and Lidl.
Great. Okay,
Sorry,
a boycott against
sorry.
Aldi and Lidl. My goodness. Right.
Sorry, that wasn't a question.
What does the Co-op board here? Yeah.
What does the panel think?
Okay, great. And I've got a question from the live stream, so thank you for that, which I think probably is directed at Ravi, who talked about taxation. So the question is, are taxes on bads a viable replacement for taxes on work if their goal is to reduce those behaviours and therefore erode their own tax base? Yes, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? If the tax is successful, then you get less revenue from it. Okay, let's start with Joe. Any of those that you want to pick up on?
Food desert, I guess. I have
Yes,
to pick
go
up.
for it.
So that's why I'm which is the lady that asked the question. Oh, the gentleman. That's why I'm having the food summit, because what I wanted to do was to highlight the good practice that there is locally as well, because there are a number of sort of champions within that desert who really see the possibilities, and I'm very keen that we share best practice from other parts of the country, and I think there's a big space for possible some form of support. So our city centre is a bit of a desert from a retail point of view, and I'd love to look at things like vertical growing and actually food production in the city centre. also things like, as you say, the kind of smaller businesses that bring that local produce in, that's just not happening in the city centre. I don't quite understand why. So in a sense, I think my role as a politician is to basically say, please come, please help. There is no commercial reason, I don't believe, why such ventures wouldn't be profitable. So what is stopping it? And you know, I guess ultimately levelling up has to be about saying there shouldn't be anywhere in the country where you can't get local produce, you can't get things that's you know, fundamentally are local businesses that are supporting the local economy and also helping with diet and so you know, but there isn't a simple answer. There isn't a simple answer.
Ravi, I might come to you on the tax point, if that's right.
Yeah. So I was involved in creating the carbon price floor about 10 years ago in government, and obviously in that example you're talking about a 30-year period of growing revenues. As carbon gets taken out of the economy, you put the price up. When it comes to things like alcohol and food and sugar, you're not aiming for eradication as you are with carbon. So I think there's more potential for ongoing revenue to be created, even if you are lowering the consumption to some degree. So I think it's obviously can't replace income tax and wealth taxes entirely, but I think it's not an insignificant revenue raiser already, and I think it could do more as well as sort of improve our food environment as well.
Great. Okay, so I think Joe needs to go. So round of applause for Joe. Thank you. Okay, I mean, we are nearing the end. We've got about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to allow the panel to respond to some of the points that were made and have final contributions. So, Chris, anything that you want to pick up on?
Well, the tax point is an interesting one because obviously there are, you know, sin taxes, alcohol duty, you know, tobacco to some degree, you know, road duties as well, which are big sources of revenue. The problem politically is always shifting your tax base because of the way, you know, people notice losses a lot more than they notice benefits. If you cut people's income tax and put up the price of their lunch, there would be an absolute outcry, even if people are, you know, better off, because you'd always find someone who is worse off, and that is where politics tends to focus. So these things are difficult to do. On the supermarket points is interesting because a lot of supermarkets have actually been quite keen for regulation on a lot of these areas, whether it's on placement on unhealthy food, you know, price promotions. They sort of don't want to be doing it, and they see their consumers pushing them away from that, but they are worried about being undercut by people who are doing it, so they'd much rather just have it banned, and then they don't have to worry about it. And I think, you know, there is a way of working with business with a regulation that businesses actually want that isn't an imposition on them. And I suppose just finally, I said, but the point about the FSA is an interesting one because obviously, you know, Jim wants to do these kind of things. It was talking about, I interviewed earlier this year, she talked about doing them, and then obviously you've got a government comes in that says, well, we don't want you to do any of that. So they're having to put quite a lot of it on hold because of the, you know, departmental status that they occupy. And maybe there will become a day when this is more like climate change, when everyone agrees it's got to be done and there's something more independent doing this. But I don't think with there yet. But it's just much harder on people's food because it is so much more personal than something quite abstract like carbon emissions. It is inherently just more difficult to do politically.
Anna, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on a couple of the outstanding comments. So your comment, which I thought was really interesting, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it because I don't know about the things that you suggested. I think there is growing shareholder pressure. Share Action has been doing some quite interesting things with Tesco and Unilever to get them to set targets for shifting sales in favour of healthier products, which I think is really interesting. We're working actually with a group of investors who are keen to see the government implement the National Food Strategy recommendation on the Food Data Transparency Partnership. So in other words, requiring food companies above a certain size to set out how their sales are shifting year on year. So I think it's a really interesting sort of avenue, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. On Harriet, your point about communities I thought was also really interesting, and I think you're absolutely right that there's more and more evidence that communities are getting on and trying to fix these problems in their own way in different places. The Sustainable Food Places Network's a really great example of that. And I think the challenges which I sort of hear from community action in that, and I think the other thing to say is after COVID, so a lot of it happened during COVID, and so now there's relationships have been formed and ideas shared and so forth in a way that COVID pandemic sort of forced a lot of those conversations. I think the challenges that I hear is that often communities are hitting up against some of the things that they want to change and they don't have the powers to change them. Some of these things we've been talking about around food environments is very few levers, even at the local authority level, besides when you get down to the real community level, to move some of these big problems. But I think you're right, it's quite exciting to see the kinds of things which are bubbling up in different places around the country.
Thank you. And then final thoughts from you, Henry.
Yeah, so looking at all those questions on big companies, so can directors change them? Can boycotting them change them? And then looking at communities as ways of tipping the system. So on the big companies, I have become increasingly convinced that I know that there needs to be regulation. We need to find a way of working, and I think it needs to be with ex-CEOs of industry to get good regulation. So the regulation, the other big bit of regulation which was brought in October the 1st, which was HFSS positioning, not being able to put them by the tails at the front of the store. That regulation was, there were all sorts of things that needed to be fixed in a hurry at the end because government had not found a way of talking to industry to say what's going to work, what's not going to work, what are going to be the problems. But we've got the new CEO of the Food and Drink Federation here today, and I was telling her, I actually don't think it's possible to have that with existing CEOs or with the Food and Drink Federation because it's too harmful to their businesses. They cannot admit there's that problem and not be fired. And fun enough, Dave Lewis, the ex-CEO of Tesco, at a big meeting the other day, stood up at the end. We had 2 days with all the CEOs of all the food companies, various people. He stood up at the end in front of all these people and said, I've reluctantly come to realise that the only way, that it is necessary to have more regulation to fix the food system. So that's what happens. That's what needs to happen at the top end. At the bottom end, community. So we looked a lot at community and local, and we tried to kind of work out. Everyone was saying, it needs to be more local. And we were trying to. A lot of the reasons why people say things should be local don't turn out to be true. It's not necessarily more environmental. It can have worse environmental impacts, the local stuff. It's not good at keeping money in the community. It just takes money from other communities. So all these arguments. But the one thing that we settled on, we realised that every good plate of food, delicious, nutritious plate of food that has ever been put in front of another human being was put there by someone who cared and who made it with care and who took the time to give that food to someone else. And if you look at a local level, when we go into schools, it starts because someone says, this isn't good enough. We need to do better. And those people then need help, they need skills, they need to be reassured that it's difficult, but they're going to get through it. But it starts with someone wanting to change. And if you go into a school, I've been to a school in Plymouth where the head said, well, I grew up on jam sandwiches, and I did all right. And we said to that school, there were some of his teachers who said, I'm not going to work with you because it's not going to work unless you have the head who cares. And so I do think these community things, as the top-down stuff happens, working with these community things, they will just blossom up to fill the space that is left. So I think you need to be doing, you need care and love, and you need regulation, and you need the two things working together.
Great, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming to this session. Thank you everyone watching on the live stream. Hopefully someone's out there. And a big thank you to NESTA and the Food Foundation for partnering with us, not only here, but also in Liverpool at Labour Party conference. If you're interested in Bright Blue, we're doing a sort of £10 membership for the year, special offer during conference. So please do speak to one of the Bright Blue team members if you're interested in supporting our work and joining our community. We're doing about 33 events here at Tory Party Conference, so hopefully we'll see you at some more events. And I think it probably, if you see on your chairs, we've got goodie bags and the whole Fringe guide is in there. So If I could say to everybody, please give a round of applause, not only actually to the speakers, but also to my team and to the people doing the live streaming, because they're doing 33 events, and I don't mention to thank them enough. So, round of applause to everyone.